to rely more on human reading, which now has been replaced a lot more with technology. I worked that way throughout elementary school, middle school, and high school. And as the years went on and the workload increased, the cost increased. There were more hours spent with these readers who had to be paid for their time. I was fortunate enough to have support from the New Jersey Commission for the Blind, which paid these readers and was supportive of my increasing needs throughout my schooling. But I was very much aware of the burden and expectation that this placed on me. My mother regularly reminded me that I had to get into a good enough college that was going to continue to provide these resources and to be worth it to an employer for them to want to pay. And when I was in high school, I had a blind lawyer mentor who told me, make sure you cultivate your brain. Make sure you do the hardest work. Because if it's the easy mechanical work, someone sighted is going to do it faster than you and better than you, and you're not worth the resources. And so I went on feeling that I had to make sure I got those resources every step of the way. I was fortunate enough to go to Harvard College, and there I pushed for more resources than the typical blind student had gotten there in the past. You see, I wasn't satisfied with just an economics major because, again, I felt it was too generic. It wasn't going to distinguish me. It wasn't going to make me worth it. And so I had to do a mathematical economics track, which tends to be taught in a more visual way. And so I pushed for the resources to get extra time with teaching assistants that the university funded to spend that time with me to make sure I could learn that material. And so after getting my degree at Harvard and going on to the London School of Economics for a master's, I continued to be a masochist for education, and I did get a law degree and a PhD in economics from Harvard. But I think I was also delaying my entry into the real world, delaying finding out what was my worth. Would I really be able to get the resources in the real world? The Ivy Tower was quite different. And so I went through, and finally in 2007, I did complete my education, which I was supported with technology and reader support throughout. And I entered the real world. And I was rewarded in the sense that I was able to demonstrate in every job I have had since that I was worthy of having extra expenditures associated with hiring. Sure, there is a legal case, there are certain standards under the law, but there is a huge variety of support available for people with disabilities, and I have known many people who have gotten more and often less resources than I did. And so, showing that I could make those resources worth it for the employer was a big part of my journey, of my work ethic, and what I focused on with every new endeavor. At this point, by 2008, 2009, technology had evolved. And so those who supported me were much more like research assistants than readers. Most of my actual reading is done with technology. But my research assistants still provided what I would call sighted interpretation for all of the visual materials on the web and the different formats of documents and materials we deal with on a daily basis. But they also functioned as junior analysts, like those many of you have worked with in your companies, doing the tasks that any junior analyst or research assistant might do. conducting research, doing PowerPoint slides, working in Excel. And so I developed a real skill for management and delegation that many of my sighted peers, particularly lawyers, did not have or not good at. And I use this at each stage to make myself more effective. When I was at the law firm, thinking about it from the employer's perspective, I thought about how I could bill more hours. When I was in the government, I had to be a little bit more frugal with the resources, but use them very efficiently. And when I was in-house, it was about being responsive and taking on more projects. But throughout this journey, I was always thinking about the worth from the employer's perspective. Last year, I made a shift. I left the world of institutional work, and I set up for myself. I set up a small business. I have my own consulting and coaching practice, and I'm working on a fintech startup that one day will hopefully make me rich, but in the meantime is draining my bank account. What I discovered when I set out on my own, what was a huge relief in my thinking, was I finally thought about the worth from my perspective. I thought about what support I needed to make me effective, and I didn't have to justify it to anyone else. For me, that was a significant accomplishment in itself. But what I realized in doing that was I thought about my hiring and my labor costs, as you put it, just like I thought about my other business costs, my technology costs, outsourcing web design, any kind of skills, networking costs. And I thought about them just like any other entrepreneur or small business owner might do. I talked to other entrepreneurs and learned things about what they were and not willing to delegate. It's always struck me that sighted people are very limited in what they're willing to delegate. They don't want to delegate things they can do themselves, even when it saves them time and money in the long run to actually do that. In any case, I always looked at what could I do, what could I get done more efficiently, more quickly, and I was going to delegate it, and that made me think like a business owner. And so what this leads to is a thinking, an ideology that I have now developed that I'd like to share with all of you about effectiveness. And I'm going to tell you about my framework for thinking about effectiveness. And I encourage all of you to think about how to adapt this to your lives and to your particular values. You see, to me, each expenditure is about being effective. And what does effective mean? Well, in my view, we all optimize our lives generally along three dimensions: money, time, and people. Well, let's go through each of these. We all pretty much want more money. It's very hard to find someone who voluntarily wants less money. So we're always looking at ways to get more money, and that's an easy one to think about optimizing. More is obviously better. But then there's time. How do you optimize time? Well, we think about the results for our time. Are we spending our time in the ways we want to spend our time? Do we have, for instance, the appropriate work-life balance? Are we spending give us other things. Might give us certain exposure, opportunities to speak publicly, for instance. And maybe that's something we value in and of itself because it's something we like to do. And so, I encourage you all to think about all of that. It's not just about money in and money out, but what else are you gaining for that money that you may or may not be thinking about? And then comes time. How we spend our time. I would say it's really about getting quality of action. Clearly, there's time that we need to put into actual work, networking, applying for jobs, building relationships. But there's also time that we need to spend to make ourselves effective, coming back to that, in terms of the quality of our actions, to get quality results. I made the commitment when I went to go work for myself that I was going to put a serious, regular time commitment into self-care. I'm much more regular about exercise than I was when I was working at a big company. I tend to focus more on nutrition, and I generally focus more on my mental wellness. And why I did this was because I felt that during this transitional time, which I knew was going to be challenging, that I had to be at my mental and physical best to have the stamina to deal with whatever challenges come my way. And so investing in my health and well-being improves my quality of action. It makes me be more resilient. It allows me to not get discouraged, or at least not for too long, when things don't immediately lead to a new client despite lots of efforts, or an investor into a startup despite hours and hours on forming a pitch deck and applications. It allows me to keep going and think about a new strategy to move forward. And third, I want to talk about people. And I know that this group talks a lot about networking. People are a great resource, and that does not need to be thought of in a Machiavellian or any sort of negative way. It's actually a very humane, respectful way. People are your sources of information. They're your sources of support. They help you solve problems. They help you make decisions. You should always be thinking about which people could potentially be answering these questions I have. Or how can I meet the types of people who would have the answers to the questions I have? And sometimes we don't actually know who might have the answers, and we reconnect with people we haven't talked to in a while, and we realize that they have something to offer us that we never would have imagined. So, even though that time initially might seem very unclear in terms of the return of reconnecting with somebody perhaps you haven't seen in a few years, sometimes that actually can lead to a very positive payoff that can be unexpected. And so I encourage you all to think outside the box in terms of cultivating those people resources. Now, I realize that many of you are between jobs, and so one of the questions that's in your mind, particularly relating to money, is probably how do you prioritize? And that is extremely important. I will put in a personal plug and say that a career coach can be very helpful in determining how best to use some of your resources. And so that is something to think about. But also to take away this framework and to be systematic yourself, to force yourself to write down your different goals, to write down what you are doing already to optimize, and what you could be doing more of, what you could be doing differently, what you haven't thought about before, but maybe now you questions to be thought about in a systematic way. And I'm a big fan of journaling for these kinds of decisions. So just to recap with a few examples of investing in yourself before I open it up to all of you, I want to emphasize, for in terms of money, you can think about spending money on courses, spending money on coaching, spending money on networking events, or looking for low-cost ways to network, such as an individual coffee with somebody who might have useful information or be willing to make an introduction. And of course, what I started with, outsourcing. If there's something that you cannot do very well and someone else could do it better and efficiently, or might give you great mental sanity, like getting a housekeeper, I encourage you to consider it. In terms of timing, thinking about how you're spending your time. There are a lot of apps these days that help people keep track of their time, so you can take your pick and see what works for you. But certainly tracking your time and looking at, where am I actually spending my time? Does that make sense in terms of what my goals are, in terms of what results I'm getting? That's a systematic way to go about it. And you'll find that after you look at the data on your time over a course of a few weeks, you'll discover some really interesting insights. You'll start to learn which weeks you start to feel more productive, which weeks you feel happier. So I encourage you to do that, different ways to keep track of time and keep track of kind of what emotions that tends to go with the different ways you spend your time, whether it be feelings of success, feelings of contentment, or whether certain weeks make you feel more frazzled, more hurried, more lethargic, all of those things. And then in terms of people, I think that LinkedIn is a great resource, and I know that you are all thinking of having a speaker on LinkedIn, and I think that is actually incredible. LinkedIn and really being systematic about your network for anyone, who for some reason isn't on LinkedIn or you haven't connected with them, but really looking through your network and saying, who have I not talked to? What kind of information do these people have? What might they be able to help me with? And finding ways to connect with them. And that is often low cost. Connecting with people one-on-one through a phone call, through a coffee is very low cost. And so if attending large conferences does not make sense for you from a cost perspective, or you're simply not a large group, a very good large group networker, then I encourage you to look at those one-on-one connections and really use LinkedIn and other tools as much as you can. So what we will do is I will open this up for questions, and then after we do some Q&A, we're going to break all of you out into maybe groups of 5, and see what numbers work well, and we're going to give you some questions to think about as a group, like a breakout session, and then come back and report to the larger group. So you'll have 10 minutes or so to discuss these questions. And the questions directly relate to the themes I've talked about. So we'll repeat these later, but just to give you a preview, the questions are going to be, how have I been investing in myself lately? How would I like to invest in myself during, say, the near term, the next few weeks? How can we use this